After Isaiah the prophet comes to Hezekiah and tells him he is to get his house in order because he's going to die of the illness that he has, we read of Hezekiah's prayer in response to that in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 3. Some claim Hezekiah's prayer was selfish. They say Hezekiah prayed outside of God's will, and they use the idea that Manasseh was born to kind of represent that, Manasseh being the son that was born in those additional 15 years that Hezekiah had, and the wicked king that he was, to say, see, this was outside of God's will, and God didn't desire Hezekiah to have extra 15 life, but Hezekiah pushed against the will of God, and they try to say then, this is an example to us that if we keep pushing against what God would want and praying our own selfish desires, that God will eventually allow us to have those desires, and look at the consequences with Hezekiah. But that's not what's being portrayed in this passage at all. Hezekiah in his prayer says, remember how I walked before you faithfully and with a whole heart. And this is according to the promise that God gave to King David, and we get an idea of that promise through Solomon's prayer in 2 Chronicles 6:16. When Solomon prays, therefore, Lord God of Israel, now keep what you promised your servant my father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man sit before me on the throne of Israel. Only if your sons take heed to their way, and that they walk in my ways and my laws, as you have walked before me. See, Hezekiah knew this prayer, and Hezekiah at this point is sonless. And so he knows the promise to David is there's always going to be somebody on that throne from the line of David, and Hezekiah is from the line of David, but he doesn't have any descendants to carry that on anymore. And that promise was geared on the idea that it would continue as long as they were faithful and followed his law. And Hezekiah's prayer is, remember my faithfulness, God. I'm keeping part of this. I'm turning the nation back to you. Why is it that I'm going to die sonless and not be a part of this lineage, and my son is not going, or my descendants, I should say, aren't going to be a part of the reigning in Judah anymore? So that's what Hezekiah is getting at. Regarding the birth of Manasseh, a father should not lose his life because his son is going to be wicked. Look at David. He had wicked sons, and God lets him live. God does not slay a man because of the future sins of a child yet conceived. Further, Josiah was born through this lineage. If it wasn't for Hezekiah's extended life, we wouldn't have the godly Josiah. Furthermore, we have indications in the Bible that during Hezekiah's last 15 years of rule, he was busy with the men of Hezekiah, who are a group of scribes. And we can read about them in Proverbs 25, verse 1, where it states, these also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. The men of Hezekiah copied the Old Testament scriptures and put them in order. We find the Hebrew letters for Hezekiah at the end of many Old Testament books in the Hebrew manuscripts. And it would seem then, in gratitude to what God had did for him, Hezekiah devoted the last 15 years of his life to putting the Old Testament in order for the people. We read about the sign given to Hezekiah by God to assure him he would recover from his illness in 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Hezekiah asked to have the shadow go back 10 degrees. So the question arises in our minds, what happened here? According to the historian James Ussher, it's apparent that the moon also, and all the frames of heaven, went backwards with the sun, and that there was as much subtraction from the night as there was added to the day. By divine providence, things were so ordered that no harm or disturbance happened to the predictable motion and harmony of the heavenly bodies. Concerning the timing of eclipses, if calculated backward from our time, the calculations yield the same results as were previously observed by the Chaldeans. So we'd have to say time itself went backwards, not just the motion of the earth. In 2 Kings 19, verses 36 and 37, the Bible records the death of Sennacherib, king of Assyria. Sennacherib departs from Jerusalem after 185,000 of his soldiers are slain by the angel of the Lord. He goes back to his hometown of Nineveh, and while worshiping in the house of his god Nisroch, two of his sons come and strike him down with a sword. It's ironic how Sennacherib had mocked the people in Judah by saying, we've taken out all these other nations and none of their gods were able to protect them from the hand of Assyria. But yet Yahweh, Israel's God, does protect Hezekiah and Jerusalem by slaying that 185,000 when Sennacherib's God can't even deliver him in his own temple. We have two seal impressions from the reign of Hezekiah that state Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. The first one is a scarab pushing the sun across the sky. But then later on in Hezekiah's reign, he changes his symbol, and it's thought to date to the time of Hezekiah's additional 15 years of life. And that symbol is of a sun with rays extending from it, and it has two wings pointed downward. And the wings pointing downward signifies God's protection. And that's significant for the time frame that Hezekiah would have been changing this. Not only did Hezekiah recover from an illness and get extended life from God, but he also was protected from Sennacherib and the invasion of the Syrian army. And so it seems like Hezekiah is commemorating that through this imagery that's on his seal. And also on that seal, right off to the side of that image of the sun and the wings, is the Egyptian symbol for life. And so again, you have that proclamation by Hezekiah of getting extended life from the Lord. And so it's exciting when we find these seal impressions being the image that was put upon items to show that they belong to a king. And so it's a great affirmation that Hezekiah was a king of Judah, just exactly like the Bible proclaims.